Well, we just found out that American MQ-9 Reaper drones have engaged air-to-air targets in combat operations with Hellfire missiles. And somehow, that isn't the crazy part of this story. The crazy part was the target, an unidentified flying object off the coast of Yemen that not only seems to defy any explanation, but seemed to straight up tank a direct hit from a Hellfire that for some reason didn't detonate on contact. And I honestly wouldn't have believed these claims if not for this footage, shared by Missouri Congressman Eric Burleson during a recent House Oversight Committee hearing on UAP, or unidentified aerial phenomena. And with NASA just announcing the best evidence of ancient microbial life on Mars discovered to date, well, now seemed like the right time to dive into this missile-wicking UFO to see if I can't get to the bottom of what it is we're seeing here. So let's dive right in. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Last week, President Trump signed an executive order officially renaming the Department of Defense to the Department of War. Though this controversial change isn't actually all that official at all. Only Congress actually has the authority to change the name of the DoD, so at least for now, the DOW is only a secondary title. And I've been staying on top of all of this thanks to Ground News. Ground News is an aggregator that collects articles published by outlets all over the world and then places them all into a single easy-to-read feed that helps me not just stay on top of what's going on, but also to see right through most common forms of modern media bias. Right here on Ground News, I can see that 112 outlets have already covered this story, including at least 21 left-leaning outlets and at least 28 right-leaning ones. And unsurprisingly, headlines about this officially unofficial change can be pretty different depending on which side of the political aisle you prefer to get your news from. But interestingly, both sides still chose to run headlines that insinuate that this name change is official. Left-leaning outlets ran headlines like, "Trump signs order renaming Pentagon Department of War," while right-leaning outlets used headlines like, "DoD officially renamed Department of War with Trump's executive order." Again, only Congress has the authority to officially rename the DoD to the DOW. But neither side of the political aisle is going to let a little bit of reality get in the way of a good headline. Ground News also provides you with vital information about these outlets along with those headlines, like their political bias, their factuality rating, their corporate ownership, or government affiliations. And I love the Ground News blind spot feature that shows me news stories that are getting lots of attention in one political sphere but not in the other. It helps me find stories that are slipping through the media cracks, and sometimes those are the most important ones. Ground News is a big part of my research and my standard news consumption, and it can be for you too. Just go to ground.news/Sandboxx with 2 X's, or just follow that link down in the description below to get 40% off the Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/Sandboxx to get 40% off their Vantage plan that'll help you stay on top of things. Now, according to Congressman Eric Burleson, this footage, captured by an MQ-9 Reaper drone operating off the coast of Yemen in October of last year, was leaked to him by an unnamed whistleblower. Now, the MQ-9 is a remotely piloted aircraft, or RPA, operated by a 2-person crew that includes a commissioned officer in the rated pilot seat and an enlisted sensor operator. The footage shows this unidentified orb in FLIR, or forward-looking infrared, as it travels along a fairly consistent trajectory at what appears to be a relatively high speed. Now, according to the congressman, another nearby MQ-9 was given authorization to engage the object. And at about 21 seconds into this 50-second clip, an AGM-114 Hellfire missile comes into frame and hits the object, seemingly causing some sort of damage with what appears to be debris of some sort coming from it before, incredibly, the object appears to right itself and continue along its way. I'll quote famed UFO researcher and witness who testified at the hearing, George Knapp, from an interview he did with News Nation shortly after. Quote, I mean, a Hellfire missile hitting an unknown object. It bounces off and the object keeps going. That's some really interesting technology, whatever the hell it is. Now, near the end of that hearing, Representative Anna Paulina Luna, a veteran of the Air National Guard, asked witness Jeffrey Nusatelli, a 16-year military police officer for the U.S. Air Force, a rather pointed question as they replayed the footage. I'll quote her now. Okay, while this is still rolling, Mr. Nusatelli, real quick, yes or no answers. Are you aware of anything in the United States government arsenal that can split a Hellfire missile like this? To which Nusatelli replied simply, no. And this, in my opinion, was a somewhat misleading question, but I'll get to why I say that a bit later on. Now, there are a number of standout details to discuss in this footage and regarding these claims. First and foremost, the AGM-114 Hellfire is not an air-to-air weapon, but that doesn't mean the broadly capable Hellfire couldn't be used in a situation like this. Now, the standard Hellfire is a semi-active laser-guided missile, meaning it'll close with any target illuminated by the laser designator. And as Joseph Trevithick over at the Warzone pointed out in his coverage, the footage shows the letters LRD space LASE space DES on screen, which suggests that the Reaper capturing this footage was using its laser designator to identify that target for the other MQ-9 to launch against. Now, this weapon was meant for use against armored targets on the ground, but there's certainly historical precedent for engaging airborne targets with laser-guided weapons. In fact, all the way back in 1991, an F-15E Strike Eagle managed to take out an airborne Iraqi helicopter gunship with a 2,000-pound laser-guided bomb. And of course, the US military has already begun using laser-guided rockets in the Advanced Precision Kill Weapon System 2 to bring down drones. At just over 5 feet long and right around 100 pounds, the Hellfire is a relatively compact and relatively short-ranged weapon, reaching out to less than 7 miles in the best of circumstances. Now, it can cover that distance traveling at right around Mach 1.3 or around 995 miles per hour and normally carries a 20-pound high-explosive blast fragmentation warhead. Now, that warhead has what's described as, quote, severe effects inside of 10 meters, or roughly 33 feet, and has a casualty radius that extends all the way out to 20 meters, or more than 65 feet. While not designed for the same sorts of targets, the Hellfire's warhead is equivalent in size to the warhead found in the AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missile, meaning it should be more than enough to bring down most airborne targets. But that's the thing. The Hellfire's warhead didn't detonate when it came into contact with the orb. And while it isn't unheard of for a weapon to fail to detonate, it's certainly weird under these circumstances. And whenever we come across something weird, it's best to dig a bit deeper to see if we can't find a reasonable explanation. Now, different Hellfire missiles carry different fuses, but based on the assumption that this weapon was carrying the standard M820 fuse, it's initially armed by a combination of an electric current followed by forward acceleration of 10 Gs or more. This prevents the warhead from arming if the rocket motor fails to fire, so you can't blow yourself up. As the missile departs and disconnects from the aircraft, that separation prompts an umbilical separation signal, fully arming the weapon. The missile then closes with its target, using its onboard laser seeker to home in on the reflected energy from the laser designator. And 4 actuated guidance fins for course corrections help guide it along that path. Now, according to a 2010 patent filed by the Hellfire's manufacturer, Lockheed Martin, once the missile reaches its target, its high-speed impact activates a crush switch in the nose of the weapon. Now, some variants also have a backup G-load switch that can register a high G impact in case that crush switch doesn't function anymore, but that doesn't appear to be standard in modern Hellfires. Now, that crush switch then transmits the impact signal to the weapon's Electronic Safe Arm and Fire, or ESAF module, which in turn detonates the warhead, which is actually housed in the middle of the body of this missile. Now, this is an important point to make here because the Hellfire missile is not designed to detonate in the same way air-to-air missiles like the AIM-9 Sidewinder or the AIM-120 AMRAAM might. Those weapons are equipped with what we commonly call proximity fuses, or in the case of several Sidewinder variants, a narrow beam active optical proximity fuse system. Now, this system detects the presence of the target within a predefined and currently undisclosed distance and sends the detonation signal to the warhead. So in other words, most air-to-air missiles do not need to make contact with their targets in order to detonate and bring them down. Instead, they get close enough to hit the target with their blast radius and go off in midair. Now, the use of a semi-active laser-guided Hellfire for this engagement would seemingly suggest to me a pretty impromptu operation, or at least a set of circumstances that mission planners did not see coming. Otherwise, they might have carried AGM-114L longbow Hellfire missiles with millimeter-wave radar seekers on board, good for striking moving targets, or even AIM-9 Sidewinders. The MQ-9 successfully downed a target drone in an air-to-air exercise with a Sidewinder all the way back in 2017, but there has been no disclosed deployment of MQ-9s with air-to-air missiles in combat zones. So, the weapon they used to try to shoot down this UAP was equipped with a crush fuse meant to signal the warhead to detonate upon impact with a surface target. It seems at least possible then that the reason the warhead didn't go off was because the glancing blow it scored on the UAP just wasn't sufficient to activate that crush switch, which again is usually impacting a massive armored target like a tank on the ground. So, while the exact amount of pressure required to spur a detonation from that crush switch has not been disclosed, it does stand to reason that it's probably pretty substantial. After all, the weapon needs to safely withstand at least 10 Gs of launching force, followed by aggressive maneuvers in flight without detonating prematurely. But even without detonating, a Hellfire missile flying through the air at more than the speed of sound can still deliver a great deal of kinetic energy to a target. And to determine how much kinetic energy, we'll need to use the formula kinetic energy equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared. And don't worry, if you hate math, I'm going to do it for you. We'll convert the Hellfire's roughly 100-pound weight to 45.36 kilograms and convert its top speed of Mach 1.3 to right around 446 meters per second. Now plug those numbers into that equation and we get 4,511,414.88 joules, or a bit more than 4.5 megajoules of kinetic energy. Now, for comparison, that's roughly the same amount of kinetic energy as being hit by a Ford F-150 traveling at 134 miles per hour. But that would be the maximum amount of kinetic energy the Hellfire could transfer if it landed a direct hit in what's commonly called a perfectly inelastic impact, rather than the glancing elastic blow that we see in this footage. Now, elastic in this context means that both of the objects bounce or react to the impact rather than fusing together and staying stationary, conserving a good portion of that kinetic energy as continued motion. And in fact, we do see the missile continue on, only a bit off course following the impact in this footage. Now that means the amount of kinetic energy transferred into the UAP, whatever it was significantly lower than our calculated figure would suggest, and could potentially have been pretty low overall. And again, while we do not know what amount of impact force on the nose of the missile is required to activate that crush switch to detonate the warhead, we can safely assume that in a weapon that is designed to impact targets with roughly the same kinetic energy as a full-sized pickup on the Autobahn, it probably takes a pretty significant bump to get it to go boom. And of course, there have been countless cases of aircraft staying airborne and even flying all the way home safely after being hit by fast-moving weapons and even ones with warheads that actually detonated. In 2003, an A-10 Warthog was struck in the right engine by an Iraqi surface-to-air missile. It never lost control, and its pilot, then Major Gary callsign Wolfman Wolf, managed to fly the jet another 120 miles over 45 minutes to a friendly airstrip. In 1991, another A-10 was hit by an Iraqi surface-to-air missile, lost its hydraulics, but still made it home, as did several other Warthogs hit by SAMs or MADPADs during the same conflict. In 1990, a U.S. Air Force F-15 was accidentally hit by a friendly AIM-9 Sidewinder during air combat exercises, causing serious damage to the aircraft, but the pilot managed to maintain control and even make a safe landing after the hit. And of course, in 1983, an Israeli F-15 had its entire right wing ripped off in a mid-air collision with an A-4 Skyhawk, yet somehow they still managed to fly it to a nearby airbase and make a safe landing. To be clear, making it home after eating a telephone pole-sized surface-to-air missile, or, losing an entire wing in an airborne collision, is not common, but it's also not at all unheard of. And your chances for surviving in these situations obviously increase pretty dramatically when the warhead on the missile fails to detonate. And that brings me back around to the question posed by Representative Luna to Air Force veteran Jeffrey Nusatelli. To those who've never worn a uniform, asking Nusatelli if he was familiar with, quote, anything in the United States government arsenal that can split a Hellfire missile like this, well, that makes perfect sense. I mean, the man did spend 16 years in the Air Force after all, but to those of us who've spent time in service, the question rings as a bit silly. No matter what the guys on Reddit may tell you, not everyone in the military is a weapons expert. In fact, most aren't, because most jobs in the military don't require you to be a weapons expert. Nusatelli spent 16 years in the U.S. Air Force working as a military police officer and was attending the hearing to share his own off-duty experience witnessing something unusual in the sky with friends from his backyard, along with accounts of other sightings that he didn't see himself, but that he investigated in service. And I have no doubt that Nusatelli was a capable and competent MP. But if I had a question about a Hellfire missile, an Air Force MP isn't even on the list of people that I'd ask. Likewise, if I had questions about advanced aerospace technologies, I'd usually go to an aerospace engineer rather than a cop. Nusatelli's experience in the Air Force all but certainly would not provide him any actual insight into the function of a Hellfire missile, but a lot of folks don't know that.
Military witnesses were asked if the U.S. had any aircraft that could withstand a Hellfire missile strike like what was seen, and they all said no.
Very intriguing.
Yeah.
However, I would contend that Representative Luna, who spent 5 years as an airfield management specialist in the Air National Guard, certainly ought to know better. Nusatelli's answer of no shouldn't be construed as meaning the U.S. has nothing that could react the way this UAP did to a Hellfire strike. It's really just the honest answer of a guy who never dealt with weapons like the Hellfire in his military career and probably hasn't sought out a great deal of expertise about it after. The only other witness at this hearing with time in service was Air Force veteran Dylan Borland, who worked as a geospatial intelligence specialist at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia and had his own UAP sighting. And again, to those outside the military community, the word intelligence in that job title might suggest some degree of expertise in weapon systems and aerospace technologies. But a geospatial intelligence specialist is an expert in the analysis and interpretation of geographical data, a job that is incredibly important to effective mission planning for really just about any kind of military operation under the sun, but it is not a job that comes with any formal training or education regarding air-to-ground weapon systems like the Hellfire. And this points to an overarching problem, at least in my opinion, with this and similar hearings. The witness testimony provided in these hearings is certainly important, but it's often provided without any real technical context beyond the layman's understanding of these topics shared within the room. Congressional representatives aren't experts in weapons or physics, for that matter, and in most cases, neither are their witnesses. So after that valuable witness testimony, we ultimately get a room full of well-dressed people just shrugging at each other and saying things like George Knapp did when he exclaimed in the hearing, "Yeah, what the hell is that? What flies like that?" If the witnesses in this hearing were familiar with the technical details of the Hellfire missile, chances are good that they would have come to the same conclusion that I did about that glancing blow not being enough to activate the crush switch and detonate the warhead. Now, that has nothing to do with the technology found in the UAP, but rather, it has everything to do with the technology found in the missile. And to be clear, I'm not saying that having a weapons expert on hand would eliminate this mystery, because I know people that I would consider to be weapons experts, and it is still a mystery. But I am saying that if the goal of this hearing and ones like it is to discuss what makes these sightings extraordinary, then someone who can actually differentiate the extraordinary from the ordinary but unusual probably ought to be invited. But, and this but is really the reason I'm making this video in the first place, none of what I just said makes this footage less interesting to me. All of that added context does help us to understand and dismiss claims about advanced alien technology rendering the missile's warhead inoperable. And likewise, it helps to better understand how aircraft can indeed tank a hit from a missile like that or worse and keep flying, especially when the missile fails to detonate. But what makes this footage so interesting to me is that we don't know what we're seeing take that hit and keep flying, which again is not unheard of, but certainly is out of the ordinary. FLIR footage can be tricky to use in aircraft identification because it prioritizes heat over fine detail, often leaving you with nothing but a silhouette of the target or a lens flare. And with just the evidence we have on hand, it's tough to really draw any conclusions about what we're seeing. But I will readily admit that what we're seeing is weird. But I also have to point out that it is entirely possible that this mystery isn't even a mystery at all. This footage was not released by the Department of Defense, but was rather leaked to Representative Eric Burleson by an unnamed whistleblower. Burleson claims an independent review of the footage to confirm its authenticity is underway, but I don't see anything about this footage that suggests to me that it isn't. But what I want to know about is the footage that we aren't seeing. We know that there were at least 2 MQ-9 Reapers operating in the area, the one that designated the target and the one that fired the Hellfire. The sensor suite found on deployed MQ-9s can vary to some extent, but generally speaking, they all carry a multispectral targeting system that includes an infrared sensor, a color or monochrome daylight TV camera, an image intensified TV camera, a laser designator that also works as a rangefinder, a laser illuminator, and a synthetic aperture radar array. That is to say that while the footage offers us very little in the way of details regarding this target and the circumstances of the engagement, the Defense Department all but certainly has a lot more information about what's going on in this footage, including what is very likely colored TV camera footage of the object itself, a general assessment of its speed both before and after the missile impact, and a bunch more. This footage, seen in full context with other video feeds from the Reapers, radar and telemetry data from other nearby assets, and more, might not be a mystery at all within the halls of the Pentagon. In fact, it might just be a very lucky Group 3 drone like those we know the Houthis in Yemen were operating, like the Qasef 1 and 2K, the Samad 2, 3, or 4, or the Houthi equivalent to Iran's Shahed 136, the Wade 1. Now, last April, an F-15E Strike Eagle tried to take down a low-flying Shahed 136 with a laser-guided bomb, just barely missing the drone and engulfing it in the shrapnel-laden fireball produced by its detonation. But to the Strike Eagle crew's astonishment, the drone emerged from that explosion and continued on its merry way. So it's not like there isn't any precedent for even inexpensive kamikaze drones taking a licking and continuing to tick. And to be honest, if this footage was of a Houthi drone that just looks crazy in FLIR, well, that would explain why the Reapers were engaging it in the first place. We've seen lots of accounts of military aviators spotting unidentified objects in the sky all over the world, but we rarely hear about those pilots trying to shoot the objects down. But off the coast of Yemen, where American forces were engaging Houthi attack drones and missiles to defend commercial shipping lanes, well, it would make perfect sense for an MQ-9 crew to take a crack at hitting a drone with a laser-guided missile if there weren't any other options available at the time. After all, it was all of these engagements with low-cost drones over the past year or two that led to the rapid development and fielding of the laser-guided and now infrared-guided Advanced Precision Kill Weapon System 2, or APKWS-2, which are guided rockets used for counter-drone operations that can be carried 42 at a time by Strike Eagles. Experimentation was, objectively, a known part of American combat operations against these kinds of threats around Yemen and elsewhere at this time. But absent any further context, any of the details gathered by other sensors, any of the footage captured by other cameras, any of the details spotted by the two drone crews, all we have is one admittedly intriguing piece of a much larger puzzle. And trying to figure out the full picture by looking at just one puzzle piece is never going to produce a very good result. Now, I understand that the point of this hearing was, in fact, calling for increased transparency from the Department of Defense regarding the UAP topic, and I think that that is a worthwhile endeavor. But I also know that this footage that's taken the media by storm could either show something that's genuinely out of this world, or it could show a fairly unusual effort to bring down a kamikaze drone that we know were flying in the area that this was recorded at around the time that this was recorded, using a Hellfire missile that was on hand and just didn't pan out. And because there's no other evidence to support either of those conclusions, the safer bet falls to Occam's razor. The explanation that requires the fewest assumptions tends to be the most likely one. So, does this footage show an American MQ-9 Reaper taking on an alien spacecraft? That spacecraft rendering the missile's warhead inert and then just continuing on its way? Honestly, I couldn't tell you. But to be clear, I cannot say for sure that it doesn't. But I can say that the first time I watched this footage, I was shocked. And I even described it as the best UAP evidence I'd seen to date. But after delving deeper into it, I don't think I can say that for sure anymore either. So I'll join the lawmakers and witnesses from that hearing in their call for increased transparency from the DoD regarding these sorts of anomalies. And in the meantime, I'm going to keep looking for ordinary and terrestrial explanations for UFO and UAP sightings that come across my desk. Because only by explaining away the ordinary can we actually identify the truly extraordinary. And I, for one, like to at least think that the extraordinary might just be out there. And with that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and now merch from all around the force. If you got anything out of this video, please click subscribe down below. I'm trying to hit 500,000 subscribers by the end of this month, and we are so close. And while you're down there, leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.